People have always been concerned about death. Some ages just seem to recognize death as more present, more of a reality than others. Our age doesn't seem to be as concerned with death. That's something that happens behind the doors of a hospital, away from sight. Our age seems more concerned, worried, and anxious about isolation. Many years ago, when I was the youth minister at St. Stephen's in Huntsville, I took a small group of our youth on a pilgrimage to Ireland. One of the places that we visited was the 7th century monastery with a high cross tower and a well. This site, known as St. Mullins, sits on the banks of the River Barrow in County Carlow. But St. Moling, who founded the monastery, has a story which begins when he lived as a hermit in County Kilkenny. St. Moling, it appears, was afflicted with sores, mostly on his legs. The cows belonging to a local widow would come and lick the sores to help heal them, but it made the cows give less milk. The widow was angry with St. Moling at the loss of the milk that she anticipated for herself, so she drove him away, and that's where he went and founded his monastery. The story goes, in establishing the monastery, he helped bless the water of the River Barrow by wading into it against the current. This practice of making a pilgrimage to the site with the well and the River Barrow and then wading into the water became a custom for pilgrims looking for relief. It was during the Black Death in the 14th century that thousands came, people of every class and order, to wade into the water together in the hopes of a cure, in hopes of avoiding death, in hopes of relief from suffering. Jesus' suffering is a large part of the experience of Good Friday, but not for the adoration of suffering, not for some magical belief that his suffering is a cure for us. Jesus' suffering is worth our attention for a much more mundane reason. It's that we suffer too. We suffer in isolation and face death too. We find ourselves betrayed and condemned too. If Jesus is God with us, fully God and fully man, then God needs to know what our suffering, isolation, betrayal, and death are like too. God needs to live these fundamental human experiences, which aren't just confined to an event long, long ago. Suffering, isolation, betrayal, and death are still with us, still what we live with. And we turn to God in moments of fear and sorrow to hear us, to help us, and to remind us that we're not isolated. Isolation is bearing infirmities. Isolation is carrying a disease. Isolation is being stricken, afflicted, wounded, crushed, and punished. Isolation is being a victim of oppression and a perversion of justice. Those aren't just the experiences of the distant past of Isaiah, and there's nothing to glory about in someone's life who endures suffering of this sort, then or now. What we may hear and know as the suffering of an individual can be equally understood as the suffering of a community, a collective people, which allows us to hear and know and believe that the suffering we endure is the suffering our neighbor endures, and is the suffering felt and experienced by God. Isolation is also seeing the face of a loved one when you're separated from a distance imposed upon you. It's feeling thirst and being unable to quench that thirst. Those aren't just the experiences of the distant past of John. Those nothing to glorify. There's nothing to glorify by those who are alone, unable to be cared for or to care for someone else. There's nothing to glorify in those who hunger and thirst only to find nothing, or to have to spend their days and their energy in trying to find their own daily bread. That these sufferings and experiences are God's experiences means everything for those who look for comfort in their isolation. God knows their isolation all too well. This is the replica of a crucifix which was popular in Ireland once it came under English control in the 16th century, and Catholicism and the Mass were outlawed. It's a crucifix designed to be easily hidden, placed up the sleeve of a garment in case you needed to hide it. St. Mullins was also a place where secret masses were held away from prying eyes, when the faithful would gather in the graveyard to be nourished by the body and blood of Jesus, who knew what it was like to suffer, to be persecuted, and to be alone. While we're separated from the sacrament of the Eucharist today, we can look on this cross, not because it's worth remembering that there's something heroic in suffering. It's because it's worth remembering that God suffers too, like we do, and like our community does. This crucifix is a visible reminder of God's presence with us when we're isolated, suffering, and fearing death. In whatever ways you may be feeling and experiencing suffering today, may this cross connect you closer with God, who knows what you're enduring. In whatever ways you may see your neighbor and our society experiencing or even causing suffering today, may this cross awaken in you the love of God and to love your neighbor as yourself. People long ago knew what it meant to suffer, and people long ago looked to God. They made pilgrimages to holy sites. They sought out sacred spaces for some recognition and relief. We can't gather together to share that sacramental relief in one sacred space, but we can still remember the stories of pilgrims of God in ages past, find our own suffering in their story and in the story of God, and then connect it with the stories of suffering we hear and see all around us, each and every day, and know that where suffering, isolation, and death are, God is there too.